since it reopened and was filled with, as they often describe it, strange, unchecked, unverified men, they've seen a real spike in crime. So locals talk about suddenly there's shoplifting. Women go to the two supermarkets and find these strange men gathering around them, trying to look in their bags, trying to snatch stuff from them. Schoolgirls no longer feel safe walking down the high street. This is a town, I think, with 4 schools, and lots of locals have described it to me and said that they, it used to be the sort of place where secondary school kids would just walk to school. It was safe. And that doesn't happen anymore. Girls don't walk to school. Even boys have been attacked.
The entire apparatus of the state is just geared against the English people who are scared about and concerned about what's going on here. Because you think Stand Up to Racism is state-funded, as you said. It laundered through charities and councils and all the rest of it, but in effect, the police are state-funded, the asylum hotels are state-funded, and so really it's the people who are going out and protesting. Their money is being taken from them and spent on these various different forces that are then being used against them.
We've of course had the likes of Katie Lamb's speech in the Commons, or footage of the protests censored for people who haven't verified their age on social media. And then when people are calling this out, saying, well, aren't you censoring adults, not keeping children safe, as was written on the biscuit tin, you have the likes of Peter Kyle, who is the Minister for Science and Technology, going on Sky News and saying, well, anyone who doesn't support our bill, including Nigel Farage, is basically on the side of Jimmy Savile. Hello, and welcome back to Deprogram. This is the new Culture Forum show dedicated to fighting back against the forces of ideological conformity, especially among the young. Our usual host, Harrison Pitt, is taking a well-deserved break. So this week, typical co-host, Connor Tomlinson, senior contributor at Courage Media, will be standing in, joined by a friend of the show, Daily Mail contributor, and the campaigns director at Restore Britain, Charlie Downs.
Good to be
here, we are joined as our special guest this week by David Shipley, an investigative journalist whose reporting you will have read often in The Telegraph and The Spectator. And I wanted to get to that today, David, because we are recording this on the first year anniversary of the Southport massacre, and ever since, it felt like Britain is on the continual precipice of civil unrest along political, often ethnically coded lines. And we remember the lead story of Southport being Keir Starmer demonising more than half the country as far-right thugs and irredeemable racists. And that was certainly the tactic that was taken in the early days of the still ongoing, I believe, protests down at Epping and now across the country. But thanks to your on-the-ground reporting, some of that was myth-busted. So do you care to take us through exactly how Essex police weren't so capable of demonising the parents protesting against illegal migration?
Sure. I think it was very interesting, wasn't it, that when these protests first started, the narrative seemed to be that they were far-right, people causing trouble who'd come in from outside the area to pick fights. And this was very much as we heard after the Southport unrest, of course, and then subsequently found out that most people involved in those protests and riots were also from their local communities. But there's a very strong effort that we see again and again and again from the British regime to try to convince us that local unrest isn't real, it's somehow fake or constructed. And I think that's almost a case of projection, because actually that's exactly what they do. And so in Epping, we've seen recently there's been a trigger for mass protests around the hotel. If you speak to locals, they've been getting more and more worried about the Bell Hotel for months and months and months, because since it reopened and was filled with, as they often describe it, strange, unchecked, unverified men, they've seen a real spike in crime. So locals talk about suddenly there's shoplifting. Women go to the two supermarkets and find these strange men gathering around them, trying to look in their bags, trying to snatch stuff from them. Schoolgirls no longer feel safe walking down the high street. This is a town, I think, with 4 schools, and lots of locals have described it to me and said that they, it used to be the sort of place where secondary school kids would just walk to school. It was safe. And that doesn't happen anymore. Girls don't walk to school. Even boys have been attacked. There have been lots of incidents where particularly schoolgirls have been made to feel unsafe, and the schools will invariably report it to parents saying a man has been seen acting strangely. And of course, it's always a man.
Epping Man was how the original Ethiopian alleged sex offender was described, if I remember correctly. And I don't know many Epping men named Hassan.
Yes, quite. This is it. And I think Epping is actually a really small town, and everyone knows each other. So all the mums say, well, if it was a dad or a man from the town, we would know who it is. And it's not. It's one of these asylum seekers. So that's the background here. The town has been feeling increasingly unsafe. And then a few weeks ago, this Ethiopian who we know arrived in the country only a week or so before, is alleged to have sexually assaulted a 14-year-old girl on the high street in a way that, if you read the details, sounds really, really unpleasant and traumatizing. He's alleged to have grabbed her, held her on his lap, forced her to touch him, but touched her, really appalling. And I think, I've spoken to people who know the family, and they say that girl is still not able to go out of the house. Is absolutely traumatized, as you would imagine. So this was the trigger, and the locals started protesting outside the hotel. And they said, actually, this is enough. We don't want these men who are dangerous and criminal and unpleasant and strangers here anymore. And of course, the response was that the Stand Up to Racism lot came up. So for the first protest on the Sunday the 13th, and there was violence between Stand Up to Racism and locals. Again, not unexpectedly, if you are a dad or a brother or a grandfather or a husband and this sort of thing is happening in your community, and then a bunch of strangers from out of town come in and tell you you're a bad person, you're a Nazi, you're a racist, you're a fascist, whatever it might be, because you don't want the girls and women in your community to be at risk like this, you get angry. So I'm not surprised by the violence. And it was, of course, presented as if it was being caused by the locals, who are all neo-Nazis, or whatever language is used. The next protest was on a Thursday, and this was the one where things got quite interesting. So Essex police, initially, the day after the protest, reported there'd been quite a bit of violence. And in their official statements, they presented it saying, there was a peaceful protest, and then some people got violent, and we had to stop the violence. And what they didn't mention was the existence of a counter-protest, and this was a fairly large group of people from Stand Up to Racism, which is effectively a state-funded entity. If you go into the accounts, I'm sure we can share the link, you can see that it's funded by things like Bristol Council and NHS Trust. It's state-funded, effectively, this entity in lots of ways. It brought a load of its protesters up, and violence started. Now, initially, the police avoided that topic entirely. And then, because there were lots of rumours and witness statements going around from locals saying, actually, what happened is the police marched these guys up the high road, escorting them, and marched them into our protest, which we felt was like we were being attacked. You can understand why. You've got the police escorting hostile people who aren't from your community, who are calling you Nazis, who are calling you all sorts of hateful terms. Obviously, you feel threatened.
I did find it quite funny when that happened that the excuse used was we were facilitating the right to freedom of assembly, which is funny. I mean, to hear the police and indeed the state speak in the language of liberal rights such as that in that kind of context was just very amusing.
Yeah, it was. To be fair, they didn't even do that to begin with. So over that weekend after the protest, I and other journalists said to them, "Okay, it's being said that you escorted these protesters up to the hotel, and that's why the violence started." And they said, no, absolutely not. We didn't do that. And I was so perplexed by this answer. I sort of went back to their press officer and said, just to be clear, are you saying that you escorted Stand Up to Racism protesters away after things got heated, but you did not take anyone to the protest? And he said, in black and white, that's correct.
If I remember correctly, the initial statement, they were hiding behind the vagaries of, we didn't bus them in. They didn't say about escorting, they didn't say about marching, but they said, well, we didn't pack them all in a minivan and drop them off at the protest site.
Well, they did put them in buses and take them away after the fighting had started.
How considerate of them.
Yes, very nice. But so then over the weekend, I was following up different videos. I was just chatting to Charlie about this. I did a lot of Google Street View, essentially. So I was patching together these videos and looking at the timestamps on them. And by the Monday, I had enough evidence that actually the police clearly had escorted Stand Up to Racism up to the hotel, which we know was the trigger point for the violence. And it's very cozy, these videos. You see them, the police officers are sort of laughing and chatting. And in one sense, it's great if the police think their job is to facilitate lawful protest and help all the protesters get to where they want to get in a friendly way. I do not think if that was a anti-asylum seeker hotel protest coming from the tube station, they would have been given the same treatment. And it's very, we've seen this, particularly over the last year or two, the kinds of protests which the state allows and supports and the ones it doesn't.
So on that point, just quickly, the quote that you're referring to, Charlie, was from Chief Constable Stuart Hopper, which was printed in the Telegraph after they were confronted with your video evidence. And he says, "We have a reasonable duty to protect people who want to exercise their rights. In terms of bringing people to the hotel, the police have a duty to facilitate free assembly." Now, I'm glad that Essex police in particular have discovered this commitment to an Englishman's liberties for two reasons. Number one, Stark Naked Brief, which is a very good X account, and Substack have catalogued a lot of the speech offences by Essex police. And they are one of the wokest on record, especially trying to charge people with the online Safety Act before it even properly came into force. And secondly, if we all remember from, I think, late last year, they were the force that threatened Alison Pearson with arrest for a deleted tweet, using a crack squad of counter-terror police because she took umbrage with the pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas marches, and again, then deleted it. So, brilliant. Glad that they've come down on the side of free speech, gents. I think we have reason to perhaps doubt their sincerity, though.
And furthermore, I mean, let's, again, imagine if it was the other way around. It's such a cliche. But some of these protesters that they escorted to and from were masked, right?
Yes, with sunglasses in the late evening.
And I can't help but think that there's no circumstances under which police should be taking the side of people who are masked and going to what's potentially a site of conflict. And so that begs the question, well, who exactly were those people with the masks and the sunglasses on?
It's one does not want to be conspiratorial.
No.
However, as we know from previous protests that have happened in this country, or even something as innocuous as the Uber riots in France about 10 years ago, there are occasionally state-funded, occasionally private-funded agent provocateurs who enter protests, spark violence in order to escalate tensions to either give the police a pretext to shut them down or to discredit the protest movement. And if there were these concerns about violence, as you mentioned, David, they wouldn't have then, in a flimsy sort of fence arrangement the following days after they escorted Stand Up to Racism protesters to the front lines, have then continued that arrangement by putting Stand Up to Racism and the concerned parents in little cages next to one another, which they broadcast their intent to do so on their website as well. Laurie Wastell shared this on Twitter, and then they took the page down, which I thought was very telling.
Yes, they've. I have screen grabbed that as well. So I think they, if we take them at face value, it doesn't make any sense, right? Because yes, they thought on one day it was fine, and what they had to do was march two protest groups together. Now, let's imagine it was a football match. You wouldn't bring together Millwall and West Ham fans and march them into each other, right? Because obviously you're going to get conflict. And the most charitable interpretation, I think, of what Essex Police did is they completely got it wrong. They cocked up and they walked these two guys together, and there was violence, and they quickly spirited everyone away. And at that point, they thought, oh dear, we've got this a bit wrong. We better keep this quiet. So that's why they gave a statement which sort of hid and obfuscated the idea that there'd been a counter-protest at all, and then why they lied about it initially, before coming clean on the Monday when we sort of presented evidence from the Telegraph. So that's the best interpretation, because yes, by this weekend they found that they can just put people in cages and that's okay apparently. So I think it's the fact there's a lot of attention now. There's lots of journalists on the ground. There's lots of reporting, and actually in a great way, it's one of the functions of having lots of smartphones. Right? I don't know how they ever thought they'd get away with it. It's a town full of people with phones, and they thought we could just pretend we didn't do this escort. When we did it through the town.
Can we talk about the what I would call police brutality that we've seen on display, with this person being hit by a police van? Are you able to tell us a bit more about that?
So this was a Met police van which drove into the person. I understand from the Met it's being investigated by their, running into people department. And it's unclear whether they think there's been any misconduct or not yet. They're sort of quite... In their initial statements, they were quite strongly sort of saying, essentially their officers felt scared and they had to get out of the area quickly, and therefore they had to drive, which I don't find particularly convincing.
What, they are officers in the large armoured vans against the local mums and dads?
Well, also, this is nothing like the post-Southport protest, right? If you look at the number of arrests, it's less than 20, I think, as of last night.
18 as of at the moment.
Yeah, so hardly any arrests. Fewer charges, of course. If you compare that to the scale of unrest after Southport, it's very obviously different. It's not violent in the same way. Of course there are a few mostly young men who get heated and maybe had a few beers on a Sunday evening and do something silly. But almost the entire protest has been peaceful. So I just don't buy the idea that the police felt they had to drive through at speed.
Hello, please excuse this brief interruption, but I'd be really grateful if you could please hit the subscribe button and subscribe to our channel. Our mission is vitally important, and we must grow this channel to ensure that our content reaches the biggest possible audience. The best way to do this is for you to subscribe. It's totally free. And in addition to subscribing, if you're able to donate or join our membership scheme, please click on the link in the description or visit our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. We've got great plans ahead, but we can't do it without your support. From only £4 per month, you'll receive a range of perks and benefits, including exclusive content. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but think that that's a kind of omen of things to come as tensions continue to escalate and as these protests continue to get worse. And I see no reason to believe that they won't, as summer progresses and as more and more incidents like the one in Epping happen, and as more and more people realise actually we've got these, like you say, these weird, unvetted foreign men, like opposite my son's school, opposite my daughter's school, whatever. And I find that very scary, really, because it shows you the extent to which the entire apparatus of the state is just geared against the English people who are scared about and concerned about what's going on here. Because you think stand-up to racism is state-funded, as you said, it laundered through charities and councils and all the rest of it, but in effect, the police are state-funded, the asylum hotels are state-funded, and so really it's the people who are going out and protesting, their money is being taken from them and spent on these various different forces that are then being used against them.
Well, to elaborate on that, so Tiff Lynch, who's the head of the Police Federation, wrote in the Telegraph that people underestimate just how ill-prepared the police are to deal with widespread civil unrest.
Yeah.
If it is larger than Southport, and we're seeing actually more protests, not the level of unrest we saw last year, but more protests in more localities than we did last year. If any of these kicked off and ignited a national movement, the police would probably be overwhelmed.
And that worries me more, in a way, than a well-equipped police force, because when police are scared, I think they're a lot more likely to do something really stupid or something really...
I think it encourages me, though.
Yeah. Okay, how so?
I think I think you're right. Scared, frightened, out of shape, untrained police sent to quell a riot are probably going to do stupid things. But actually, if you look at it, the big gathering at Southport, at Epping, most recently, they had police from 10 police forces there.
Right.
And that's the amount of manpower they had to pull in just to police one of these things. And actually, the collapse of British state capacity, we know, is seen everywhere. And it's seen in the police as well. There were videos getting streamed out of Epping where you had these crowds of very out of shape, clearly struggling riot cops jogging out after a van and not after a police van, not managing to catch up with it. I mean, it's sort of, and I think so much of state power of every state rests on the belief that it has the capacity to exercise force. Right? I don't think it's really there in the British state anymore. And actually, I think that is encouraging for those of us who think that the British state has lost legitimacy, that actually it needs to be replaced. Yeah,
well, and I do think that it further confirms this feeling that a lot of people have, that the only language that the British state now understands is not force, because we disavow force, the use of force and violence, but the threat of force.
Yes.
And that was shown, I think you wrote about this, David, that was shown especially in Hare Hills last year.
Yes,
where these local communities, to use the language of Starmer, essentially organised and went out into the streets and said, listen, if you don't release this... I don't remember the exact details of that case, so I won't.
It was I believe it was a Romanian gypsy family who'd been accused of Roma. It
was child neglect.
Yeah, accused of injuring their child, and it was taken off them by the local authorities, and then the local community decided to riot, and then the child was given back without the investigation.
And this is what the English community is now coming to understand, is that, and you wrote about this as well, David, in one of your pieces, the ballot box, they just ignore votes, parliamentary petitions as well, whilst quite a useful, they're a useful tool, and they're one that we use at Restore Britain, as viewers may know. There is this toolbox that we have at our disposal as a demos, but actually so much of it is just met with complete ignorance or complete dismissal. And so when people feel like they don't have those peaceful means to make their voice heard, well, what recourse do they have?
Exactly, and I think it's not surprising that the English ethnos, looking around, seeing all these other groups getting what they want through the force or the threat of force, are starting to think in the same way. And that's the natural situation that we've created by running the state this way. And I think another sign of the state's weakness is the way it just lies a lot now. It doesn't actually have the capacity to use force really anymore. And so it just lies to us. We're told that it's far-right protesters from out of town who've come in to start these riots. We're told that we have freedom of speech. We're told that we
haven't imported thousands of Afghan sex offenders who have...
For example, the state actively used the courts to lie to us for years about the mass importation of Afghans, many of whom we now know to have been actually Taliban. So the state lies because it hasn't really got anything else left. And again, I think this is quite encouraging because I don't think it's going to take much collective action I think it'll take less collective action than we might believe to push it over the line.
So what comes next then, David? We have this state that doesn't listen to the majority of the population, not to mention the fact that it's the indigenous majority that they don't listen to. They seem to continuously take the side of criminals, of sex offenders, of foreigners. People feel they don't have a voice. Tensions are increasing, crime is increasing, the economic situation is getting worse.
Well, not if you're listening to Fraser Nelson, everything's tickety-boo.
Well, sorry, Fraser, you're quite right. I look out on my high street and I think, do you know what? This looks better than Britain did when my parents were growing up. Thank you, Fraser. Anyway, what comes next?
Well, I think that's the question, isn't it? We clearly need to have some kind of regime change, I think, or effectively a new constitutional settlement. The British state has kind of been operating this model since 1689, and it's obviously just stopped working. We can't build things, we can't actually make things happen, we can't police, we can't manage crime, we can't secure our borders. It stopped being a functioning state, really, in lots of ways. And I think it stopped being a legitimate state because it no longer responds to democratic signals from the majority. People have been voting against mass migration for 20, 25 years, and yet politicians stand on these manifesto commitments and then just ignore them, most egregiously, of course, post-2019, but for decades.
But even before then, the popularity of a certain Mr. Powell when he gave a certain speech, it was the majority of the population even back then.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think the issue we have is that democracy, I think, is held as one of the British values, isn't it? That we're supposed to love someone.
On a decidedly non-British hand, I must observe.
Yes, parliamentary democracy is held as one of these British values. But I think people get democracy a bit wrong in that they think it's a tool for making good decisions, which is not really. It's a tool for avoiding conflict during times of power transition, right?
Yeah.
But the only reason that works is because people believe that their vote will be honoured. And really, I think since the Brexit referendum, we've seen this succession of really blatant efforts to ignore or reject things that have been voted for. There were endless judicial and parliamentary efforts to stop Brexit happening when it was clearly what had been voted for. And similarly, people keep very clearly saying, we don't want mass migration anymore. We don't want these communities being brought in to live in our hotels, in our towns, in our villages. And they just get ignored. And, even local councils are talking now about seeking injunctions against the Home Office because the Home Office won't even talk to them about this. So it's broken down so completely that Whitehall, I think, is completely separated out from the rest of the country and in many ways starts to look more like a remnant occupying arm of the British Empire that is now ruling over the English and oppressing them.
So it's worth looking at the government's reaction to this because I think we all at this table, an increasing number of elite defectors, understand the problem, whether it's the handful of Conservative MPs who have taken the opportunity of their historic defeat as a moment of reflection as to why the electorate gave them such a kicking, or the likes of Rupert Lowe, or the growing support base for reform, whether or not reform are living up to their name is a separate question.
James McMurdoch as well, another independent MP.
Quite the appetite for this change. But I think the state is showing a sclerotic inability or unwillingness to respond to these concerns. Dominic Cummings is another of these elite defectors. You could debate his culpability for some of the problems we've seen. I mean, he was pro-lockdown after all, and that hasn't done wonders for our finances. But he has come out in recent Substacks and said the state is telling itself these kinds of spellbinding fictions to maintain the illusion of control, even though they can't muster the force to actually clamp down on, he says, the far-right brackets code for white people. And I think that the state has been, in recent days, living up to this accusation from Cummings with the passage and implementation of the Online Safety Act and Labour ministers trying to spin this on air. We've, of course, had the likes of Katie Lamb's speech in the Commons, or footage of the protests censored for people who haven't verified their age on social media. And then when people are calling this out, saying, well, aren't you censoring adults, not keeping children safe, as was written on the biscuit tin, you have the likes of Peter Kyle, who is the Minister for Science and Technology, going on Sky News and saying, well, anyone who doesn't support our bill, including Nigel Farage, is basically on the side of Jimmy Savile. I'll form this as a question. How sustainable do you think that sales pitch is for what the Labour government's attempts to censor discontent is going to be?
I think it's running out of road, isn't it? No one really believes them. The odd thing is this government only got elected a year ago. It's got a huge majority, but it feels like the tail end of 14 years of the Tories. It feels like a government that has no ideas, and it's very strange. I think they know that they're flailing around, and you can see it. And the Parliamentary Labour Party is, blocking any kind of sensible adjustment to what we do with benefits, for example, that might make the country a bit more fiscally sustainable. And I think it's going to get worse with the Online Safety Act. There's a huge amount of anger in the US about this. So Preston Byrne is a good friend of mine. He's a US free speech lawyer, and he represents quite a lot of tech firms who get these threatening letters from Ofcom. And he's talked to me about the way that actually the White House is wants to know about every single one of these threats. It's taking them very seriously. And the Americans really don't like it when other countries threaten their citizens and try to violate their First Amendment rights. They get very, very angry about that.
The State Department are also unhappy with not just the legislation that the EU and the UK have been passing to restrict not just their platforms, but also our own citizens. They see us as a kind of fallen motherland. They've got more concern for our liberties than our own government does at the moment. But they also don't like Keir Starmer lying to Donald Trump's face. And make no mistake, they know that he was lying in Scotland the other day when he said, we're not censoring anyone, we're proud of free speech, to Bev Turner. So you're quite right on that, I think.
Well, Starmer has this very weird definition of it's a very loyally definition of free speech, that you have the freedom to say anything that's legal.
Very Soviet.
Yes, it really is. I mean, it does feel like the end of the Soviet Union. We have this sort of chaotic collapse. We've got crazy Afghan policy. We've got, now we've got the defense secretary talking about how we're going to sail around the world to fight China in the Pacific, which is maybe more Russian Empire 1905, and I'm sure it'll end as well. It's just, it seems like a state that's just deluded.
Insisting there's no graphite on the roof.
Quite. I don't know whether I buy that this is the tail end of this, though, because I put something up a couple of days ago where I said that if something doesn't change in the next 10 years, then this is basically going to be unsalvageable. And a lot of people replied to that saying, it's going to be this year. It has to happen this year or next year or whatever. But I think that it's easy to be in the bubble that we're in and to feel like things are reaching ahead. But I don't think they are. I think there's still a lot of people out there who, the lights still work, the car still starts, there's food on the table, I've still got a job, and all the rest of it. And all the while that remains the case, I think that a lot of people are just not going to be moved to, truly, resist this stuff. And I don't know whether, maybe I'm wrong about that, but what do you think, David?
Well, I suppose it depends what resist means. I think if you look at the polling, we're a year into this Parliament and Reform are on 28-30%. The Tories and Labour are both on about 20%. I think the election last year was the electorate giving the Uni Party one last chance, saying, OK, the Tories clearly aren't managing, we're going to give Labour a go. And very quickly they've become disillusioned with Labour, because clearly Labour have exactly the same solutions as the Tories. They're merrily implementing the Online Safety Act, which was a Tory law, of course. And there's very quickly the electorate now saying, actually, we're going to vote for someone different. And this is before the economy has worsened substantially, which is likely to do in the coming years. But, with the increased taxes, we're going to see things getting worse. Before more and more migration comes in, and that becomes more and more salient an issue. So clearly the electorate are not happy with the status quo. And I think the question, therefore, is who is going to win power? What do they do with it? And, do Reform have the robust set of well-thought-out, serious policies that we might want to see? Or are they just existing as a protest vote at the moment? That's a big question.
Another factor as well that wasn't the case. Well, there was the looming threat of it some of the electoral counts, of course, but it wasn't formalised at the last election. Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn's Fruit and Nut or Jezbollah party, whatever they decide to call it, they still haven't got a name. They're still crowdsourcing branding.
I heard the Collective.
I heard the
Okay.
Left Party or the Left.
That's a match.
Right.
Yeah.
So they're either becoming German communists or the Borg from Star Trek. Excellent.
Yeah.
Maybe both.
But I think that will hemorrhage a significant number of Labour voters among mainly young Muslim voters. Extra disastrous, considering they're going ahead with lowering the voting age to 16. And also, there's been a bit of a spat in the Green Party. I occasionally keep up with their internal politics when I need a good laugh for myself, because the councillor Mothin Ali, who announced, Allahu Akbar, this is for Gaza, which Harrison and I have joked before must mean Arabic for recycling. He's trying to go for joint leader, and he's just gotten himself in a bit of hot water because he's refused to commit to the party's pro-LGBT policies. I wonder why. So how much of that Green vote will move back over to Corbyn's splinter faction, who are myopically obsessed with the politics of the Middle East, one country in particular? I think so. Labour will hemorrhage votes away from the left, they'll hemorrhage votes away from the Red Wall towards reform, and so you're right, that uniparty will collapse, but we've still got 4 years with them in the driver's seat to entrench and consolidate the gains of the Blairite revolution. So the question is, how capable is a successor government of actually unpicking all of those gains that have been made over like 30 years?
Well, I think a successor regime has to seek to be more than be a new government. I think we need a new constitutional settlement. So I think we need to strip away, be almost as dramatic as 1689. Establish from the ground up a new Bill of Rights and a new constitution. I think part of the problem we've got is we've almost got so much legislation now which impedes action, which limits public bodies in what they're allowed to do, which runs them into legal action when they make certain choices, not least things like the Equality Act, but also environmental legislation and planning legislation. And I think anyone who's serious about saving this country has to have a plan for day one. How do we completely reset the Constitution? And that has to be planned out years in advance. And that needs to be the work that organisations like yours, I think, need to be doing now, is actually saying what is the very specific war-gamed plan for what we're going to do, what we're going to legislate, and how we're going to do it quickly as well. There'll be a window of that first year, let's say, where everything really has to be done and legislated.
Yeah, well, that is very much something we're working on. I'm told that there are elements within both the Conservative Party and the Reform Party who are doing, or attempting to do the same thing, which is always heartening to hear. I mean, we have yet to see anything substantial from either of those organisations at this stage. But hey, we are on paper a number of years away from an election, so maybe they're biding their time. I mean, I think the moment is now to be to be putting this stuff out. But I think you raised a really interesting and important point there, David, which is that I've been thinking about this a lot recently. The framing of reform, the idea that what we need is small r reform, I don't think it's quite right.
No.
And actually, the name of the party, Reform UK, I think is quite telling, because as we all know, the UK, this kind of meme that's been born and has really taken to the mainstream.
For those who don't know, it's the description of the aesthetics and culture of an emergent multicultural
and
new country.
political structures as well.
Yeah, within Britain. So think drill rap or Deliveroo.
Yeah, the YOOKAY, UK.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Kundadrukpa.
Indeed, independent journalist. So that the idea that what we need to do is reform the UK, I don't think it gets it right. What I would say is we need to restore Britain, which is the state that existed on these.
Nice plug there, Charlie.
The state that existed on these islands for 1,000 years before the birth of the UK.
Yes, I think this is it, right? British values are really UK values.
Yeah,
and actually, even parliamentary democracy is quite new in the story of these islands, and I think whatever we do next has to be a looking back to a much earlier time. And I do think there's a model or a lens you can look at what's happening now and see it as the end of the British Empire. You look at how the British Empire oppressed people in India towards the end of the Raj, and there's a lot of uprisings. It used very, very excessive pre-trial detention, which generally leftist scholars of empire will say is this incredibly oppressive method of controlling speech. But actually, of course, we see that a huge amount now in England. We see substantial use of pre-charge detention or remand for people who are committing speech offences. And I think England and the English and the Welsh and the Scots and the British generally need to liberate ourselves from this regime.
Well, I think it was actually Harrison who said recently that the English and the indigenous peoples of the British Isles need to start thinking of themselves as a stateless people. We're almost like the Kurds in a sort of way. The UK government, and that's what they call themselves. They're not the British government. They are the UK government, gov.uk. They're not our government. They may be, it may be occupied by people of our group, but they're not us.
Lots of empires have ruled like that throughout history. The fact they co-opt some of the natives into their ruling elite doesn't actually mean they are representative of the people of the land.
Yeah.
And I just don't. What is a legitimate state? A legitimate state protects its people. A legitimate state serves their interests. A legitimate state guards them. It protects their borders. It ensures that trade and the rules of trade are honoured appropriately, and there's a legal system. And here we have a state which imports those it knows will do us harm and does nothing to protect us. A state which enacts a two-tier justice model in which we are made less safe, in which lots of criminality is just allowed, particularly from particular groups, and a state where our borders don't really exist. So in what sense could the United Kingdom be legitimate?
Yeah.
Do you think they're cognizant of their own illegitimacy? Because I get the sense that they are deep within the Starmer bunker, quaking with fear and reaching for the metaphorical revolver. Because I think it was a very telling measure that they leaked. I can't remember whether it was first to the Daily Mail or the Times. Starmer's cabinet briefing with his Downing Street chief advisor and himself and Angela Rayner, all warning of imminent civil unrest, the need to repair Britain's fraying social fabric, telegraphing that to win favour back they might do a major crackdown on law and order, and then that crackdown on law and order taking the form of a new Home Office police unit trying to monitor anti-immigrant sentiment online, basically to stop the natives noticing the problem they're importing in rather than actually dealing with the problem themselves. Do you think that their reach is exceeding their grasp and they kind of know this, or do you think that they're so locked in ideologically that they can't recognise all of the problems they've baked into the system and cannot avert course?
I think it's a bit of both. I think they obviously recognise the problem. They do get briefed on this stuff. And if you look at the Home Office, they're clearly trying to be seen to be doing something about illegal migration. They're trying to police illegal working a bit more, and they're trying to have raids and be visible. And although they were initially resisting sharing this information, they eventually gave asylum hotel locations to Deliveroo and other delivery companies to make it easier for those companies to identify illegally operated accounts.
Problem solved. Right.
At least initially the civil servants were refusing to disclose that information because they thought it'd be a safety risk to the migrants. And it was only when Matt Dathan and I from the Times wrote a piece about this. Then about 2 weeks later, they sort of went, okay, actually, we will give that information. So I think they get that there's a problem, but I just don't think they're psychologically capable of recognising that the problem is essentially everything we've done for about 40 years.
Well, this is what I increasingly think now, because for a long time I bought the ideological possession idea, and I think that there is a certain amount of that certainly within the ranks of the British regime. I think there are people who are absolute true believers in human rightsism or
Dame
whatever.
Andrew Eagle being
sure, and there's plenty of people, but I increasingly think, especially following the revelation today, that there were allegedly members of Rotherham Police Force who were engaging in rape gang activities. I increasingly wonder whether the absolute, unmoving refusal to actually do anything about the state of the country perhaps points to something far more troubling, which is some kind of personal involvement or just a feeling among our leaders that if we lose power and if a real meaningful change is brought to the system, a lot of stuff's going to come out which is going to see me at the very least run out of town, and if not that, possibly end up in prison or worse.
I mean, I think that's going to have to come, and part of what the new Britain needs to do is reckon with what's happened with those rape gangs, and particularly the complicity or even direct involvement of public servants. And what we need is a full inquisitorial investigation which will identify every public servant who's guilty, will prosecute them, which will sentence them. And I think we should prescribe them as well. We should see people losing honours, losing property.
Well, I would reinstate the death penalty for those most guilty.
I think if you are in the same way we have laws now which say if you attack a police officer, it's worse. I think equally, if you're a public servant and you are abusing that trust to commit these heinous crimes, then the punishment should be the most severe thing we can offer. But I think the sort of the public nature of that needs to come is very important as well. We need to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. It must all be disclosed. And I think part of what a new regime would need to do is sort of almost have a Total Freedom of Information Previous Governments Act.
Yeah.
And just everything gets published. There'll be no more secrets.
Everything. Yeah.
And every guilty person will face the law. And I think that's really, really important, because I don't see how we as a country heal without that. So I think if people are worried about that, they probably should be.
So essentially a truth and reconciliation project, so to speak.
Not sure how much reconciliation I would want particularly.
Well, okay, yes.
I think there'd be truth and justice.
Truth and retribution.
Okay. That's
justice.
That's a better framing.
Yeah.
So
this isn't about. I think there are some crimes which are not forgivable on this earth.
Agreed.
And I think to betray your own people and to betray a public office in the sorts of ways we're discussing, I don't think that's forgivable on earth.
Yes. Okay. Agreed with that framing. So, question that then leads me on to: if the state for the last 30 or 40 years has been a sort of Russian nesting doll of vested interests, and we can use just Stand Up to Racism as the perfect example. The Home Office funds the Paul Hamlin Foundation, Open Borders Charity, who establish local migrant networks of rapid response activists. Anytime a spontaneous parents' protest happens in Epping, they stand there with their placards. You've got all of these unions like ASLEF or the National Education Union who are funneling Stand Up to Racism and Socialist Worker Party materials into schools. You've got this vast charity nexus that's been funded by politicians of both stripes.
Just on that point very quickly, the Paul Hamlin Foundation being a particularly egregious example, their people are at the highest level. Like Madeleine Sumption, I think her name is.
She's on the migration
advisory. She's on the migration advisory. I think she's in charge of it, is she not?
I believe so.
In a very senior role.
Yes. So all of these people, it's a big club. None of us are in it, so to speak. If there is so much dirt on all of these hands, are there any political figures at the moment that we feel will not only have sufficient courage to tell unpopular truths, as some of them have started doing, but if they bring these prosecutions, these investigations forward, and it implicates, by degrees of even separation, people they've worked with or have gone to dinner parties with, do we expect many people to be capable in the British state of such a feat?
I think it's a hard one, isn't it? You probably need very, very moral autists. Essentially.
Well, there is a slight history off of that. Like there is a growing new right where we know a lot of these guys. They're men of virtuous character. They're very intelligent. They get the issues and they are more willing to do things like this because they haven't been contaminated by SW1 yet. So.
Yeah. And I think that's important. I think, if you speak to people who've worked in Westminster for any length of time, it's a very morally corrupt environment, as is much of the civil service. A lot of the work I do is around the Ministry of Justice and the prison service, and the scale of complicity and corruption within that branch of government is astonishing. And the links with, Masonic networks and organised crime are horrendous. So I hope it's not as bad in other departments I'm less familiar with, but I think there are absolute nests of poison that need to be rooted out, and I think we'll have to do it. It will have to be that's why I think we need truth and justice. It needs to be a process where a lot of people, who maybe have just been a bit corrupt, if we can put it that way, will have to be put in a place where they lose their state pensions, they lose any honours they've had, they lose all their property. And we publicly make it clear what has been done, because again, we have to send a lesson to the future to say, actually, this should never happen again.
Sorry, go on, Dave.
There's something that happened during some periods of the Roman Republic, which I think might have some applicability here, is that when people were prescribed, their sons and grandsons could also not hold public office. And I think there's something quite powerful and symbolic in that, and saying, actually, okay, the fourth generation, if you work hard to restore your family honour, maybe you could take public office. But there will be this signal sent down through the generations. And I think it's, how do we create an institutional and cultural memory such that these things don't happen again? And I think if you have to explain to your son, well, actually, you can't join the local council, you can't be a policeman, you can't join the army. Well, why not? Well, because your grandfather did a very bad thing. But if you live a good life, your son could get to do that job. That is a very powerful mechanism for transmitting that memory through the
and facilitating a meaningful circulation of elites. Because
Yes.
we know that even in so-called democratic politics, these dynasties do exist, where it is essentially aristocratic and that power is inherited.
Yeah, interrupting those is quite a benefit.
and I think that's absolutely essential, because you've touched on something there again, which I think more and more people are thinking about, and I've been thinking about this a lot recently, which is that I think every era contains within it lessons, for mankind, basically. And I think the lesson of the era through which we're living, which it's not been, that I'm aware of, shown in such stark terms as this, is that you cannot just substitute one people for another and expect things to be the same, and expect things to be prosperous and safe and secure. And that actually, if you do that, you will completely destroy a society. And so making sure that future generations know that, and not just repealing laws that allowed it to happen in the first place, but installing and passing laws that prevent it from ever happening again, is absolutely essential. Because the idea of rolling back to, let's be arbitrary and say 1997 when it comes to laws, I think that's a pretty good start. But then the question is, which direction do we go in from there? Because we can't just continue on this in my opinion, this quite hands-off approach that really England and Britain had sort of taken for most of its history. We live in a time now where we have to be very, very firm and clear and explicit about what we're going to permit in our country and what we're not going to permit. So, I think you need to have laws making mass immigration impossible and other things.
Well, certainly, I think making it almost impossible for migrants to gain citizenship, or look at how the Gulf states do it. They have very multi-ethnic societies, but they only allow people to come there and work, and when your work is over, you leave. Yep. And they're a perfectly reasonable way of importing labour if you want to, without destroying your demos.
Yeah.
And I think broadly I'm a pro-markets person, but I think this is one of the mass failings of late neoliberalism, let's call it, is that it thought that every single person was an interchangeable economic unit, and they are not.
Final question. Professor David Betts, who usual host of the Harrison Pit, has done an excellent interview with over on The Forge. Do go watch it, it's very instructive. Is pessimistic about the possibility of a political off-ramp to prevent widespread civil unrest. Are you optimistic about this vehicle to repeal all these laws and push based world into being coming about in the next few years? Are you seeing early signs of it, or are you quite pessimistic as things stand?
I think it's doable. One of the great things about the Crown in Parliament as our model is we can actually do anything. If the Charlie's Group do the good work over the next few years, and the government that takes office, in 2029, very quickly executes a set of legislation to transform our constitution, it could be done in a matter of weeks. It's much, much easier to do a constitutional reset here than it might be in the USA, for example, where it's a very, very complicated process. So I think there's a window to get it right. I think the real danger is if we get a government that comes in without any clear idea of what it's doing, or without any preparedness to do what has to be done, and it drags itself on till the mid-2030s, I think at that point you might start to see a catastrophic collapse in support for democracy. And what happens if we go another parliament without anything being fixed, I think is very, very dangerous.
Excellent. Well, I hope things at least stay the course enough so that the next time we have you on, David, we're not having to talk through yogurt pots with a bit of string. Charlie, thank you for co-hosting, my friend.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you all for watching. Please like, subscribe, share this video if you wish to do so. Sign up as a member at the NCF to support our work. And until next week, goodbye.
Our mission at the New Culture Forum is and always has been to defend and celebrate Britain's history, culture and its people, and indeed Western civilization, at a time when both are under sustained attack. We have grown from small beginnings to become the country's most influential right-leaning cultural think tank. Our content is watched and read by some of Britain's most influential political figures. But now, we need your help. If you believe in what we do, then please do become a member. For as little as £4 a month, you can make a vital contribution to what we do. As a member of the NCF family, you will help ensure that we can continue to produce quality content online, such as our 3 weekly programs, Whittle, which is our flagship interview show, Newspeak, our panel discussion show, and Deprogrammed, which is targeted at Britain's youth. As you probably know, in addition, we produce important documentaries such as our critically acclaimed 6-part series, The West, a stunning celebration of the history and genius of Western civilization, and our ongoing documentary series, Heresies, with hard-hitting episodes tackling subjects such as immigration, gender ideology, and BBC bias. But the New Culture Forum is much more than a YouTube channel. We don't just complain about Britain as it is, we provide real solutions and clear policies on how we can push back against the madness and restore sanity to this nation. Our presenters are now highly sought after and have become familiar faces across the media. Our prestigious annual Smith Lecture and our regional and indeed national conferences have attracted world-class speakers. Perhaps most importantly, we are the only organisation on the right of politics that has launched a national movement without actually being a political party. And uniquely, through our NCF Locals programme, we've established some 30 active branches in towns and cities right across the nation, from Edinburgh to Exeter, and with many more on the way. We're very proud of what we've achieved, and our members have made it possible. In return, our members receive access to exclusive content, invitations to private events, free or discounted tickets to our conferences and lectures, free copies of our books, and much more. I very much hope that you'll join us too by clicking the link in the description or going to our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Now is the time that we need your help. Thank you.